Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynn Holtain. I'm the Executive Director at the Victoria Law Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this final Research Network event for 2023. Today, we're looking at our suite of work on mapping the administrative or service data work that we've done across several parts of the justice sector in Victoria. And I'll fill you in on the format in just a moment. But first, the VLF stands on unceded Wurundjeri land, and I very respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians, recognising their abiding connection to this land, its waterways and community. It is my privilege to pay respects to their elders and to all the generations who've nurtured this land for over 50,000 years and continue to do so. At the VLF, we believe that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better and more equitable future. We recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We aim to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians through our work in research, education, and grants. And we are committed to making a sincere and positive contribution to a better justice system for all of us, especially those most in need. A few housekeeping matters before we get this show on the road. We are, as you'd be aware, in webinar format. So that means that only the panelists can be seen and heard during the presentation. But please use the chat function and introduce yourself and make comments. But if you'd like to put a question, please use the Q&A function. And there you can also upvote other people's questions if they're covering the same territory that you're interested in. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get to as many of those as we can. We are recording, and we will distribute the link to the recording after the event. So if you have to leave early, or if you've got people who are just busting down the door to see it, please feel free to forward that on to them after the fact. Well, we've got a slightly different format today. We're looking, as I mentioned, at a suite of work around data mapping. And I'll give you a very brief overview of the whole project now, and then I'll hand over to our principal researcher, Dr. Hugh McDonald, to talk you through the methodology across the three substantive reports. And then we'll talk through some of the conclusions that we draw in the fourth report, which was our effort to pull some threads together and to point to some we think, really useful opportunities to deliver better access to justice using administrative or service data as a key tool. Then we will get a fantastic case study from Richard Hodge, who's the Director of Innovation and Service Experience at the Magistrates Court of Victoria, and then we'll take your questions. So if you've got all that, let me set the scene. Once upon a time, research at the VLF was but a glint in our eyes. After accepting the recommendations of the Access to Justice Review, the Victorian Government amended the VLF Act in 2018 to include research as a function. So we started thinking about what we would research. One thing we did know very early that we would need to do was to get a clear sense of what data was being collected and held across the sector, in what formats and for what purposes. This was foundational material for an organisation embarking on research, and we knew we would want to engage and work with different agencies across the sector, and that it would be useful for all of us to have a survey of that data landscape. So the data mapping project was born, and as I've mentioned, it resulted in 4 reports. The first 3 took tranches of the sector and asked about their holdings of and their applications for this data. They were the legal assistance sector in our apples, oranges and lemons report, courts and tribunals in Smarter Data, and dispute resolution and complaints bodies like Dispute Settlements Victoria, the Ombudsman and the like, and that report was called A Mixed Bunch. The fourth report, Calibrating Justice, is a synthesis of all of that, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Predictably, what we found was a very diverse landscape. Parts of the sector and players within those parts are at very different stages of data development. So even within particular tranches of justice, there is a significant spectrum of expertise and sophistication. They're working in different systems with different aims, but we also identified that they've got some interesting and aligned aspirations. But let's start where we should. So what is administrative data? It's otherwise known as service data, and it's data that most organisations collect, and at its most basic, it's counting widgets. How many, by whom, to whom, and for what? Administrative data gets done regularly. It gets collected principally for operational reasons, for logistics and planning, as well as for reporting purposes. But because it's done routinely over time, it can show trends, which other moment-in-time data can't. And because it counts stuff, it's often big data. And as I mentioned, its first purpose is for the agency itself, reflecting levels of activity and productivity, but it can be used in smart ways to understand much more about the people we're serving. That is, to get a sense of their access to justice. And this is very much the lens that we were using, and Hugh will expand on that perspective in a minute. In Victoria, we have a very mixed picture in admin data. There are some great developments, which we'll hear about one a little later from Richard, and some which are stuck with old systems and significant resourcing challenges. We found quality and consistency of data is very patchy, which has profound consequences for its use, particularly at a higher, more systemic level. We also saw very little by way of coordination or sharing of information using admin data in the sector. And once again, Hugh will go into this, but we identified some of the barriers to greater connectivity and some of the potential too. In Apples, Oranges and Lemons, which looked at legal assistance, we heard putting resources into data collection and analysis is not the highest priority when you've got people in need at your door. So if it comes to a choice about where the dollars go, data is not often the winner at this point in time. And yet, as we all know, understanding more about what the legal assistance sector does and for whom is critical if we're going to find more effective ways to respond to growing need. There's also demand on services to acquit funding streams using different combinations of admin data, whether that's federal or state funding, project money, philanthropics, the usual spread of options. So it is put to different purposes for different audiences, but not all that often is it used in the interests of clients and access to justice. In the courts report, we saw that any change to systems is a multi-million-dollar prospect. Numerous sites, diverse physical environments, big workforces, which all have to be coordinated to move in a new direction. And we don't underestimate that challenge or that cost. In dispute and complaint resolution, the Mixed Bunch report shows, predictably, a very mixed picture. You've got separate organisations growing up in separate times with diverse remits. And appropriately, these organisations take enormous pride in their independence, and they don't see themselves as a system and are not often fully recognised as the enormously important dimension of the justice system that they are. So the issues are varied across different parts of the sector and certainly within parts of the sector. Our central tenet, which we will come to in more detail later, is that if you want to serve the people of Victoria better, you need to see them. Organisations of whatever type need to recognise who are they supporting and for what. This is, though, a shift in the historic approach to administrative data, which has for so long and for good reason been focused on the internal machinery of each agency. What happens along the conveyor belt of service? What does each step cost? How many staff are needed? Is the physical or online space adequate to deliver service? It's not geared to consider who's coming, why, and who's not coming, and why not. What happens to people either side of the service that could make a difference? In short, it's currently not giving us a clear understanding of the experience of justice and a more systemic understanding of the interplay between the component parts. But we reckon it could. There are a couple of key dimensions to admin data which we'll explore this morning as well. We look specifically at data quality, which is vital if you're going to use it for any major service design and essential if there's going to be any kind of aggregation of data across players in the sector to get a higher view. And we also looked at data coverage, by which we mean how much do services know about who they're dealing with. In very rough terms, what we found was that courts and tribunals had high quality but very low coverage. Legal assistance was low on data quality and consistency, but strong on coverage. And dispute and complaint resolution bodies sat somewhere in between, depending on the agency. With improved quality and greater coverage, however, there is huge potential in the effort to put Victorians at the centre of this system. Admin data is a really valuable piece in this puzzle. I'll come back and join Hugh shortly for an exploration of the barriers and the potential that we've mentioned already. But first, I would like to invite him to give you some insights into the main findings of the first 3 reports. Dr. Hugh McDonald is our principal researcher and renowned for his deep and lengthy inquiry into how our justice systems work and where they fall short. He was with the Law and Justice Foundation for many years before joining the Victoria Law Foundation, including working on the Law Australia-wide survey, Australia's first and to date only national legal needs work. He has also, of course, been closely involved with our legal needs and capability work through the Public Understanding of Law survey. He led the data mapping project together with our former colleague, Josica Cooten, so there's no one better to give us a tour of that work. Over to you, Hugh.
Lynn. Thank you, Jackie, for starting the slides. Maybe we'll just jump straight to the next slide. So yeah, this morning I just want to cover briefly some of what we did and some of what we found to lay a bit of a platform for the following discussion. Next slide, please. So certainly from the consultation processes that were done to establish the research agenda and function, a really common theme that a lot of people or a lot of organisations across the civil justice system in Victoria wanted to know about was, well, they were all collecting a lot of data. They all felt that they were holding a lot of data, and surely that data could be used for something. So they were particularly interested in how that data might be used. And if you cast your mind back, this was a period where big data was a bit of a buzzword. There was a lot of interest in, machine learning, in data analytics, in forward indicators, in looking at how data can be used to better understand organisations and get a little bit of a sight into the future. With so much data being held, well, surely it's big data, surely it can tell us something. So this is kind of a jumping off point for us. And, a bit of a giveaway, it's not that easy. It's not just a simple case of collecting up a lot of data and shoving it in a file somewhere and then letting machines run through that data to do some analysis and draw some insights. It can be done like that, but we're of a view that that's not particularly useful. Next slide, please, Jackie. Another one of our starting points is that we very much come at this from a research point of view, and there are certain things that we know in approaching access to justice issues. So we know from empirical research across the last 20 years, we've got some insights around the nature of the different types of people who experience legal problems, what type of problems they experience. what people do about those problems or don't do in response to them. We've got some vision through the survey research in particular around who tries to use law in the justice system and who doesn't, and what they achieve and what they don't achieve. We got some insights around who's making use of legal information, legal advisors, who doesn't, who's self-represented, who's trying to struggle through a process using self-help. And we've got a little bit of an insight around what outcomes happen, what people achieve, how matters are finalised, whether people are satisfied with those outcomes or not. So again, that's part of the jumping off point for this project in particular. So Jackie, next slide, please. So as Lynn sort of outlined, very interested in what can all the administrative data that's generated by the civil justice system tell us? What's its utility and for examining access to justice questions, and how is that data being used currently, and how would organisations like to be using that data in the future? And yeah, what coming at the same question that we sort of approach from the research point of view around the surveys, around what people do and don't do. Also, what can the administrative data shed on that same question? So looking at the same issue from two data sources, I guess, which provides opportunities to triangulate and to get a deeper understanding of what's going on. Next slide, please. So what was the data mapping project? Well, as Lynn mentioned, it was very much a sustained examination of these issues, particularly the use and utility of civil justice data across those three parts of the civil justice system, followed up by a summary report. So I might just skip to those report covers now, if we can go to the next slide. So that's just a rough depiction of what we did and when. So we started apples, oranges, pre-COVID, reported during COVID, but you can see we put out a report every year following as we moved through the stages of the project. Next slide. So what were the questions? It was a sustained look through these questions through the three substantive reports. So particularly what data systems are used, how flexible are they, what were organisations and users planning to do with those systems, were they looking to change and improve them, looking at what data is collected, what that data covered and how it was being used. We did an examination of what data governance and quality assurance practices were in place, and came up with an assessment of what the data quality and utility was, particularly looking at what access to justice questions the data can and can't currently be used for, and then trying to get a sense of what would be most useful to organisations in terms of perhaps improving and changing their data to develop deeper insights, and what organisations were doing to follow that aspiration. Next slide, please. Just to cover off the methods quickly. So for data mapping 1 and data mapping 2, it's a series of structured interviews and document analysis. In the case of the legal assistance sector in Victoria, we had structured in-depth interviews with 29 of the 49 public legal services, Legal Aid Commission, both First Nation services, and 27 of the community legal centres. With the courts and tribunals, this was right in the middle of COVID. We still managed to get interviews with all 6 Victorian courts. We weren't able to secure interviews at that time with the Commonwealth courts. But we also included 3 case studies of parts of the Victorian civil justice system in that report, which included the court network. So that's the volunteer support program operating at courts and tribunals, at some courts and tribunals. We did an in-depth look at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre and with the VCAT's Koori support team. When we looked at dispute and complaint resolution bodies, though, we changed the research method. So on the basis of the findings of the first 2 stages, we had a fairly strong indication of the key themes that were emerging. So we pursued those key themes in the 3rd stage of the report with the dispute and complaint resolution bodies by use of an online survey. Again, this was at the tail end of COVID. And an online survey was a sensible method to pursue that study, where we managed to get 24 of the 40 dispute and complaint resolution bodies operating in Victoria. At this stage, we ended up with 7 of the national bodies and 17 the Victorian bodies. Next slide, please, Jackie. I'll just really quickly run through some of the findings. Lynn's touched on some, but I'll just again set a little bit of a foundation for the later discussion by mentioning some of what we've found. So in the legal assistance services, we found that data practice was varied considerably. There was quite good coverage of user demographics. There is a national data standards manual that supports this. However, there's variation in the data quality and the consistency that we found, different interpretations of some of the data standards, different reporting practices, different ways of recording and counting. The data was mainly being used for reporting to funders. Every single legal assistance service does that, and does that extensively in some cases. I think on average, services had 9 separate streams of funding to report against. Sometimes that might be funding from the same source, but for multiple streams of activity. A common theme, though, was that the data doesn't sufficiently capture complexity, both of clients and matters. But there was strong interest from the organisations interviewed in terms of capturing outcome measures and understanding what services were achieving. So there was an overriding interest in services really wanting to know if the services they were providing were meeting the need of clients and users, and whether it was the best use of their resources and service strategy. So really, I guess this makes perfect sense in the face of overwhelming demand from the community from assistance. You really want to know if your services are making a difference. We also found that there was, evidence of differential data capability across the services. So there was a very strong sense that some services were more advanced and developed than others, and some services faced significant challenges in their data practices. Next slide, please, Jackie. When it came to courts and tribunals, there's a strong sense that the data was mainly being used for operational and reporting purposes. In this case, administrative data is exactly what it says on the tin. It's administrative and operational. And again, this makes sense with courts and tribunals having to rely on data and information collected to, contact parties, to schedule meetings, to book courtrooms, to keep the functioning of courts and tribunals operating. The data utility when it came to courts and tribunals, though, was somewhat more limited by its data coverage. Generally speaking, there isn't good coverage of demographics in terms of the people involved in disputes of courts. However, there was interest in collecting data to better understand court operations, performance, and litigant user experiences, particularly as the experiences of different types of users are being increasingly recognised as impacting on court processes and outcomes. There was evidence of strong data practice and quality when it came to courts and tribunals. In part, this was because that data was reviewed extensively in the reporting that goes to national organisations such as the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So courts and tribunal data is one form of administrative data which goes into some of the national statistics. So there was a stronger look at that data and the quality of that data through that process. But we found that courts and tribunals were also at different stages of development and capability. They had different data systems. There's a phenomena in courts and tribunals of data systems being progressively updated over time. And when the data system of any one particular court was being updated, it was generally leaping to more modern and recent technology. So we have a system where some more modern data systems are just more functional than some of the older legacy systems. But overall, it was quite striking at just how far courts and tribunals had come probably in the last 10 to 15 years. So some of the interviews were quite striking in their ability to contrast how the data used to be with the developments that have been made. Perhaps the best indicator of that is that you don't have to go back that far in time to have data being periodically updated. So you might only have an insight into, say, the backlog of cases every 3 months or every 6 months. But now with modern data systems, there's like a real-time indicator. So the speed in which data and information is coming to the attention of organisations is much quicker and more comprehensive now than at any time in history. Next slide, please. When it came to looking at dispute and complaint bodies, we had to go through a little bit of a complicated process in terms of identifying, well, who are these bodies? What do they do? What distinguishes them from other types of organisations? And in doing that, we come up with sort of a ballpark calculation that the types of bodies that are handling dispute and complaints from members of the general public and which are some of the organisations that have been specifically set up to help Victorians and Australians settle civil disputes. They handle an awful lot of matters. We calculated getting up to 250,000 matters a year. But that calculation is not simple because of the nature of the bodies, the nature of how they count things, and the terms and the methods that they use to collect their operational data. So we think we have been one of the first people to actually look at this that part of the justice system as a whole. And we definitely think there's much more that needs to be understood about what they do and achieve and the difference that they make. But it's undeniable that they're an important part of the civil justice system, and a part of the civil justice system which is, I think, often overlooked. But when it came to dispute and complaint resolution bodies, we really did find a mixed bag, hence the name. Of the report. Organisations were at different stages of data development. We saw strong variation again in data quality, use, and data capability. In particular, substantial variation in data coverage and what data was collected in what form. Again, we found very strong gaps amongst some organisations in information about their users. Again, there were strong aspirations from many bodies to learn more about their users, particularly how their users were affecting resolution processes, and also what outcomes different types of people were achieving. So that's the first 3 reports. Lynn, did you want to join back as we move through collaborating justice?
Sure. On you go. Next slide, please, Jack. So you start, Hugh.
So yeah, when it came to collaborating justice, went through a process of looking through the findings of the first 3 reports, and really looking for key themes and key issues and challenges. So just really simply, we have seen improvement over time in both the use and utility of administrative data. We saw consistent stories around data improvement journeys. We saw aspirations in the use of new systems and technology. We saw data practices becoming increasingly sophisticated over time, and we saw strong appetites to go further with data and move to more data-led and data-informed decision making.
So, Hugh, I thought we might talk about this in terms of the challenges and the barriers that we identified in particular circumstances, but also, as you've mentioned, some very common themes, and then talk a little bit more about the appetite for change, because I think we also identified that, as was apparent in those quotes that you put up at the beginning of your presentation. So we saw challenges around systems, clearly, about actual hardware and software, in I think all contexts, and particularly in legal assistance. That was a particular issue, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And as I think I mentioned, the choice, such as it is, between more frontline service provision and committing funds and resources to what's often described as sort of back office data collection and analysis, it's not really a choice at all when you've got people at your door, is it?
No, it's a really insidious choice, particularly legal assistance services, with what we know about so many people seeking help, so many people seeking help from multiple advisors, people on a help-seeking journey. So the one person might express a need to multiple services. So services are faced with having to sort out who they're able to provide services to with the resources they've got, and who they have to turn away. So in the face of that constant stream of people seeking assistance, data work and investment in data is often, and has often in the past been, given less of a priority. There's also funding aspects to this. Like historically, we have had certain funding stream which have put priority on frontline service provision. So when new money comes in, it is for frontline services. It's not for back-end administrative support. It's not for improving data systems.
And there's a need to acquit against that. So it's not as if you can sort of, use it for purposes that you would prefer. It's very much committed to the frontline service, and understandably so.
Yeah, and when it comes to courts and tribunals, a big investment in data systems often has to be the subject of a separate budget submission, where it gets weighed against all the other competing demands, sometimes both within the organisations, because obviously courts and tribunals and dispute and complaint resolution bodies have a wide agenda of things they would like to be able to do, of which improved data may only be one of them. But often there can be sizable investments where if you don't receive a substantial amount of money, it's not really possible to tinker around the edges. But that is exactly what happens. So when you don't receive large data, there's this constant sort of tinkering around the systems and seeking improvements and changing some practices, which, unclear as to whether that's necessarily sort of from a system point of view, the best use of resources.
And we're sort of flipping in and out of both the issues for the individual agencies, but also on the system side, if you like, to think of the justice sector as a system. I think that's another podcast conversation. But if we end up in a circumstance where there are short-term fixes or organic innovations made around the edges to systems, and we see this particularly in legal assistance as well, the prospect of being able to compare apples with apples gets more and more distant, doesn't it? I mean, because each service has found a bespoke way to respond to its own particular need, we're not in a position to say that there is any real consistency across players.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where we get to in the implications that we teased out in this report around identifying a strategy and identifying some coordinated approaches to covering off similar types of information. Now, I guess there's always these challenges you've alluded to between organisations pursuing things separately because they think they know that that's best, and then being able to do things in a consistent way where we can have a shared understanding and discussion about what's happening at a system as a whole. So we've got some challenges there.
But I suppose the question then for the different parts of the sector is, why is that in their interest? I mean, as researchers and as people concerned with the functionality of the system as a alleged whole, it makes sense to us to want to be able to get that higher order view and to see the moving parts with greater clarity, hence calibrating justice as the title of the fourth report. But why is that of value to the county court or a CLC in regional Vic?
Yeah, I guess we've got an opportunity. I guess historically we've seen some access to justice research and understanding become stalled because we've kind of exhausted what administrative data can tell us. Hence, there's an international interest and movement towards making more use of administrative data to hopefully unlock a new era of access to justice understanding, which some people around the world have sort of referred to as access to justice 2.0, to get a more sophisticated understanding of how the bits and pieces of the justice system operate together. One really good example is that it's quite surprising, but where we have reform in parts of the system, it's sometimes hard to work out what the access to justice implications of that reform have been for particular types of people, without some sort of data insight around the demographics for a range of people, without having some sort of baseline understanding of what the state was at T1 before a reform. It's really hard to tell what the impact of that reform has been on different groups of people at T2. And equally, it's hard to tell what reforms in one part of the system have done to other parts of the system, because we know, say, where legal aid services are in a position where they have to be tighter on the types of, say, duty lawyer services that they provide, that is likely to result in higher numbers of self-represented and unrepresented people going through courts, which we know has an impact on the courts and how they can operate. And so it's a case of a reform in one part of the system can, reverberate and impact more widely. And that's exactly what we don't have good understanding of. So some sort of shared approach, shared understanding to some of the data issues can potentially be harnessed to get more of an insight and to have a greater understanding about what the benefits and also detriments of reform might be in access to justice terms on different people.
We'll come back to some of this, but I want to get to the potential that you and I have both alluded to, but I think it's worth just mentioning that we also took a long, hard look at capability across the sector, both in terms of people's capability to collect data consistently, who was inputting the data, therefore, what quality did it have. But then there's capability in terms of the analysis and the application of that data as well. And I think we would say that certainly in 2 out of 3 of those sectors, capability was probably in need of some significant upgrade. And that's no fault of anybody's. It's just that, these skills are not particularly inherent in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. But equally, though, we do see quite a strong movement in recent years to hiring more staff, particularly in legal assistance services, in courts and tribunals that have a role in doing that work.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So again, that reflects the really strong appetite and some services really wanting to get more of an insight, particularly around the impact of their services that they're having, which goes to really fundamental questions around service design, service implementation, and so some really fundamental challenges. So some really fundamental decision making. And I guess this is again where the data is increasingly going hand in hand with some of those decisions.
There are some cultural dimensions here too, and we'll perhaps tease this out in just a sec when we talk about the ideas that we had for next steps, if you like. But there is a very strong and entirely legitimate commitment to confidentiality in the sector, to ensuring that that your clients and the people who use your services are protected, that their information is protected, and hence a bit of hesitation around, for example, more information sharing. Is that something that you really bumped into?
Yes, very strong. We're still in early development. Like a lot of organisations, particularly with issues of data being hacked, clamping down on data practices. So we see the modern phenomena of data governance requirements at a lot of places, a lot of organisations, and very legitimate interests in terms of how data is collected, being very clear with people as to how that data will be used, what it can and can't be used for. So that is undoubtedly a strong barrier to particularly data sharing or potentially data joining between different parts of the system. It's a challenge, though, which, you know, if we want to develop understanding and deepen our understanding, needs to be managed in a sensible way. I mean, we're again at an era now where data collection has never been easier, cheaper. So there are ways forward to collect data, but there are challenges to do with sharing it. I mean, we have a particular interest, say, at a system level with the civil justice system, just understanding how referral works and how people move from one organisation to another. And that's part of a broader picture where we don't really have good understanding around how people move to navigate their way to the civil justice system, the pathways that different people take through the system, what outcomes they achieve, which really is fundamental to the whole access to justice concerns. We have inherently difficulty assessing how the system is performing. It's a common view to always view the civil justice system as being in crisis, but we don't necessarily have a good insight as to the nature of activity that's going on, and, you know, whether it's getting better, whether it's getting worse, whether it's getting better in some places than others, whether it's getting better or worse for some people.
Let's just quickly mention your genius idea of a data strategy before we throw to Richard. So this is expanded in much greater detail in the Force report, and I invite everyone to have a look at that. But you mentioned a wee bit earlier the challenge in language, that if you, for example, count matters or inquiries, they can be different things in different organisations and mean different levels of service, and therefore put different kinds of demands on the service provider. So even at a very basic linguistic level, there is some opportunity to talk about how we name these things and therefore get to a position where we have a common language for the things we're talking about and the way in which we provide service across the justice sector. So that's one bit. But do you want to talk about the data strategy, which is this idea of at least inviting parts of the sector to talk at whatever level is comfortable at the outset, and then developing a much greater confidence around data going forward?
Yeah, maybe, Jack, if we skip to the end slide, I think it's where we cover these issues. I think, yeah, the next, yeah. There are, I think it's fair to say, strong differences of understanding throughout the system. I think we come up across during the project different understanding of some sort of key basic terms. There's always the complication around, you know, things like different understanding of outputs, of outcomes, of impacts. We're not necessarily talking with a shared language everywhere, so there is more work to be done to demystify some of these terms, perhaps what they mean, perhaps how outcomes measurement or data collection can be used, what it involves, with a view to also developing a shared understanding of the implications of collecting such information, the benefits as well as potential detriments. It's also, I think, a lack of understanding or a lack of consistent understanding in many basic bits and pieces where different organisations just have different organisational interests. So there has to be a way to move beyond that, or else we're going to be stuck in sort of access to justice 1.0 situation for a while. But there are blossoming bits where there are shared interests and certainly shared interests in doing some further data sharing or data joining to understand the interface and various parts of the justice system a bit better. But yeah, certainly more broadly, sort of we tried to present a view that really we need joined up solutions for some of these problems, that they are beyond the ability of any one organisation to sort of pursue benefits themselves, that there needs to be at least some ability to coordinate and communicate between different parts of the justice system. I think another important aspect is that there isn't a single data solution to there's no magic data set that will answer all of these questions. We really need a suite of data. We need data in different forms to answer different types of questions. So generally, we would say, depending on the nature of the question that you're interested in, you're going to need data that is appropriate for answering those questions. So there's, a suite of data that we think is needed. So administrative data is part of that magic jigsaw, but it's a mosaic. It's a jigsaw. It's one part. We also need other forms of data. We do need, of course, we're going to say you do need the legal needs survey data periodically to provide a different perspective. Of course, administrative service data only provides information about people making use of services. So we do need a broader picture, but we need to be able to put those bits and pieces together in a more comprehensive way.
Absolutely. As you say, different questions require different components in their response, but as people will be aware, we have recently delivered PULSE Part 1, Public Understanding of Law Survey, which looks particularly at legal need, and PULSE Part 2 will come out early in 2024, looking at legal capability. So hopefully that adds to some knowledge of the way in which the sector is operating and the way in which Victorians are experiencing justice issues. So we'll come back to some of that, I'm sure, in the Q&A. And I would invite you, if you've got a question, to please put it into the Q&A function and we'll get to it very shortly. But it is my enormous pleasure now to introduce you to Richard Hodge, who leads the Magistrates Court of Victoria Service Centre, which was recognised in June this year for its innovation. It was awarded the Citizen-Centred Service Design Award at the Institute of Public Administration Australia's Leadership in the Public Sector Awards, which recognises the Service Centre as an exemplar of innovation, demonstrable impact and inspirational delivery for the public sector and the Victorian community. Richard, I don't know if it gets any better than that. I couldn't come up with any greater accolade for what you've achieved, but it is a significant development in the Magis Court and for courts in general, I think, to indicate that this can be done in a statewide service working absolutely at the coalface of justice. So we're very, very thrilled that you could join us to give us a quick sketch of the way in which the Service Centre operates. Welcome, and take it away.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the VLF for the opportunity to present today on the MCV Service Centre, an accessible, integrated and person-centred contact and justice support service provider, which the Magistrates Court of Victoria has operated since 2022. But firstly, I too wish to acknowledge on behalf of myself and the Magistrates Court of Victoria the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. So, by way of a little context, the Magistrates Court of Victoria operates out of 51 court venues across Victoria, and they're aligned to 13 court regions, of which you can see the headquarter courts. They're highlighted in white on the picture. The court responds to a significant work demand. Just one quick example of this, there were over 715,000 criminal listings within the Magistrates Court last financial year. So with this, operating such a vast network of court venues with constant daily service demand naturally has its challenges, complex legislative and procedural matters to prepare, judicial support needs, and general in-person hearing coordination does create a highly demanding environment. The increasingly complex operating environment required the court to really consider how it needed to adapt its operating model, really to firstly empower our court venue staff with more capacity to support the conduct of hearings for parties, especially for vulnerable court users or those with complex matters, and thereby maximising the time and expertise of our judicial officers and court staff, whilst importantly improving the user experience. To do this, what we needed to do was to remove, or at least transfer from those venues, the public inquiries and other service demands which did not specifically need to be immediately addressed in that local court venue, with staff who were at the time seeking to support people who are preparing themselves for that court's hearing day. So we had to work out how we would move those inquiries elsewhere, creating more capacity for the court venue. Next slide, if I may, please. The court had already commenced its journey to centralise digital contact and administrative support some years ago, following the government's acceptance of all recommendations resulting from the Royal Commission into Family Violence 2016. From this Royal Commission, the Magistrates Court was supported to establish a small central intervention order contact centre, which we did in 2018, offering public support services for family violence and personal safety related matters for a limited number of courts. So we fast forward to 2022, where MCV was contending with the highest pending matter levels in its history due to a pandemic-affected service environment. These circumstances required a significant shift to online hearings. It needed us to respond to population shifts, which impacted capacity for servicing in regional buildings that were not necessarily set up or designed for that volume of matters. And combining that with just the constant changing social, technological and legal environment, which creates just the practical operational challenges for courts. So all of this was put to government for support, and the MCV Service Centre was established as a criminal jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction service, commencing in March of 2022. The vision at the time, and what has been realised, is for the MCV Service Centre to operate as a centre of court service excellence, providing best practice public servicing through prioritising the user's experience. As you know, going to court is a life-changing event for many. Adopting of service reforms, including leveraging technology and driving digital service standardisation for the public, meaning regardless of what court you contact, be that by telephone, email or web chat, the service timeliness and consistency will be the same. As of today, the court has a central service operated by a team of dedicated client service officers. And we were very deliberate with that title as well, supporting all three MCV court jurisdictions across Victoria. operating contemporary contact management systems to efficiently respond to public and system partner or stakeholder inquiries, and expediting people's court readiness needs as one holistic MCV service centre. Next slide, if I may, please. Operationally, the MCV Service Centre has become a critical and integral part of the court service offering, addressing an access to court services gap because the court had to prioritise those people attending on that day to engage all court users, but particularly the most disadvantaged and vulnerable members of our community prior to their court hearing day, whilst building connectedness across the justice system. So I just wanted to put some service volumes up to back this up. So whilst you can see some substantial statistical totals, these really, the global numbers, the yellow numbers, really relate to the criminal and civil jurisdiction service, which we commenced in March of 2022 and are really in a staggered manner, rollout manner. But underneath each one of those global numbers is the monthly statistics for October. And these clearly were last month and relate to the service that we offer across all three jurisdictions: criminal, civil, and intervention order. As you can see, we're talking about a central service that last month alone delivered a total of 51,203 public inquiry and justice services. If we use that month to average out across the year, that's over 600,000 inquiries and support services per annum provided by the MCV Service Centre, which would otherwise have flown back into local courts to deal with. And with that, it would force those staff at those local venues to make a decision whether to pick up the phone or the email or deal with the person who's queuing at the front counter for their hearing day. A really difficult challenge, and one, as you could appreciate, the person attending the court for the hearing day was the priority. Next slide, please. So whilst we have high service volumes, I just wanted to point out that we also have a high degree of service quality. So a 7.8 minute call time average means the court is spending the time the caller needs to help them through their matter readiness, or indeed their person readiness for their court experience. 16-second average caller wait time highlights the court as accessible to the public. Only around 1% of calls are abandoned before reaching the court, or 99% are taken by the court. And these abandonments, this 1%, is unlikely to be due to service accessibility with a 16-second average wait time. 90% first-time caller inquiry resolution, which sounds very impressive on itself, but when you add into that, some inquiries just have to go back to the local venue because of local nuances, then that result is actually much stronger than 90%. And there are some other user satisfaction results on this slide, but I might go to the next slide and tackle them here, if I may. So I pulled out the web chat and telephone service user satisfaction data. So the scores that the public provide us at the end of that phone call or the end of that web chat exchange. And what this shows us as the court, that whilst delivering high volumes of service, the court client service officers have been able to maintain a very high standard of service quality. So 93% good or great user satisfaction rating for our live agent web chat service, and a 92% good or great user satisfaction rating for our telephone service. And as you may appreciate, the Magistrates Court services people who are experiencing a range of emotions leading up to their hearing: criminal matters, family violence matters, personal safety matters. So to have a public response at over 90% with people sometimes under trying circumstances is something we're very proud of. It provides good evidence backed up by what people communicate in person to us on the phone call or on the that our service has reframed their expectations of the timeliness and consistency of court service access across our digital contact channels. And I might just add that the Magistrates Court of Victoria is only the second court jurisdiction in Australia to offer a public web chat service. Next slide, please. In addition to direct operational benefits to the court and the experience of the court user, the Service Centre is working on building our capability to support all court users, as well as the court's interconnectedness with the justice system. We're currently partnering with disability support service provider Scope Australia, progressing through a 2-year service accreditation to upskill our Service Centre staff with the right techniques to engage court users with disabilities or low literacy levels. We're building out pre-court referral pathways to legal support services, increasing pre-court readiness and strengthening an interconnected justice system. We are valuing person readiness for court as much as matter readiness or administrative readiness for court, including connecting people on their hearing data support services. And we have established a relationship with Language Loop to offer arrangements to bring in a third-party interpreter into live phone calls within 30 seconds for callers where English is not their first language. We have aspirations for more arrangements, which lead to warm referral pathways across a range of legal and other support organisations to improve the court user journey and the efficiency of the system. This includes information to us and information from us. We know that from the Pulse survey, the court user's experience is their experience of the whole system, not just one part. And in this way, we, the justice system, must be more than the sum of our parts in constantly working towards a more efficient and responsive service offering. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to close on some recent recognition. I think Lynn touched on it a little bit earlier, that the MCV Service Centre received. In June of this year, the MCV Service Centre was recognised by the Institute of Public Administration, being awarded winner of the Citizen-Centred Service Design in the Public Sector Award, beating, if that is the right term, a range of other wonderful service providers in the public sector to be acknowledged for this award. At the time, IPA acknowledged the MCV Service Centre as an exemplar of innovation, demonstrative impact and inspirational delivery for the public sector and the Victorian community. And other justice system organisations have also acknowledged the Service Centre, and I've pulled out a couple of published articles on this slide, and I thank them for their acknowledgement. And finally, we were also very proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Victoria Law Foundation, representing our great state at the International Access to Justice Forum last month. Thank you to Lynn and for all those at the VLF for all your hard work to organise and co-sponsor the event so that we could present this significant service change for our court and for the people of Victoria attending court to other justice service providers across the world. Thank you, and that is the end of my presentation.
Oh, Richard, you know, mutual admiration, it's it's a fine thing. But before we get to the Q&A, given that you came to our Access to Justice Forum in Los Angeles, what did you learn? Because I know that a lot of organisations and academics present at that forum were very impressed with what you presented, but what did you bring away?
Thank you, Lynn. Look, for myself and Melissa, who attended as well on behalf of the Magistrates Court of Victoria, first, we were honoured and pleased to be attending and representing Victoria. And what we heard was that there's some real consistency across the challenges experienced in the justice system and from our lens, the court system, the same challenges around online court hearings and how do we embed online hearings into our operating model from a court's perspective without losing that gravitas which a person can experience when they walk into a building. Some of that, smart forms, and different techniques to really take out the clunkiness of coming to court and preparing for court, and really with that focus on the user. So some different jurisdictions were using things like avatars, and AI in particular was starting to come through in that forum, and how AI might be used to support people's readiness for court, and how they received information as they walk out of court, because for some people it can all be a bit of a blur on the day, and so that we can educate and help people to really understand what their order is, and how that was what that requires of them coming out of court. A really enjoyable and insightful, and we've got a little list of things we need to follow up across the globe over 2024. So we've got those contacts and that activity to progress, to really continue to the magistrates courts digital and service delivery transformation journey which we're on.
Good, excellent. You mentioned people readiness and matter readiness, which I think is something very close to Hugh and I's hearts, in terms of certainly the people readiness part, and clearly, you know, the system response through matter readiness as well. There has been a comment come through in the chat around some concerns that have been raised by CLCs about the support at local courts for people of diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and for family violence victims as victim survivors from that cohort as well. They're not particularly digitally savvy. It's going to be a challenge for them to engage with the system through the service centre. Is there a recognition of those particularly vulnerable and difficult to reach court users as well?
Absolutely, and we all know technology is not the solution for everybody, and digital servicing is not the solution for everybody. It is something that we the court believe that we can be better at, and we can certainly service those people who are technology competent and prefer to contact and engage with the court over digital means. And if we can do that, what that would lead to is more capacity for individuals who might not choose to contact the court digitally and would prefer in-person contact, attending a court venue. So really, it's hand in glove in terms of, if we can take away a volume of digital contact and support people who have a preference to dealing with the court over digital channels, that by extension should create capacity at local courts for people who may not choose or be able to use those means. So what we're trying to do with the service centre is to flow capacity back into local courts to take inquiries that don't relate to that day's hearing away from the court. If they do relate to the hearing and organising that day's hearing, then certainly the court and the court user need to be engaging at that local venue, because that daily list is being constructed. But if it doesn't relate to that specific day, we have dedicated, trained, talented people who can spend the time with the public on the phone, on the email or web chat, and help them through their preparations for their hearing day away from that court venue.
I should just do a quick ad for Pulse Volume 2, which comes out in February next year, because it will look at capability in particular. And we also have a block of questions around digital capability, which Hugh, I think, will be particularly telling in terms of the way in which the sector is looking to digital responses in order to understandably address huge flows and significant growth in demand. But we need to be really mindful that it doesn't fix the problem in toto. There are always going to be people who are not in a position to access those kinds of supports and services. But I wanted to come back, Hugh, if I may, to something that was in my mind as we were talking earlier, but has also come up in the Q&A around complexity, because this is another issue that we are particularly involved with and engaged with at the VLF, because as we've identified certainly in Pulse and in other work and in this work too, there are people with complex legal problems, and then there are people in complex circumstances, life circumstances. Often the two go hand in hand, but it can mean that responding to that in a service context is really difficult. And I think there is growing recognition of complexity and what that means for service delivery. But did this work give us any kind of new insight into how that might be addressed, or what kind of admin data insight would be useful in responding?
I think absolutely, and undoubtedly. And I think it piggybacks exactly on what Richard just said. If we can have a better insight into the nature of complexity and the impact it's having, there's an opportunity to redirect services to where it's needed to have to assist people in the best way. So not everything is complex. There are some things which are simple and straightforward. And if we can deal with them in a simple and straightforward way, again, it frees up more time and resources and energy within the system to devote to the more complex, both in legal matter terms, but more importantly, in people terms. There are so, for example, there are a number of people struggling with what legal people might see as very simple and straightforward matters. But because of the circumstances that they are in, it's not simple and straightforward. And there's an opportunity to unlock some of the constraints within the system to be able to respond to need better. I mean, for a long time, we've been saying, sound bites such as, the system should mirror and respond to need and complexity. Well, that's something easy to say. It's difficult to operationalize, and it's different to operationalize without being able to see different types of people and different types of complexity. Administrative data can be quite shallow in terms of delving into into some aspects.
Oh, I think we've got a frozen Hugh. Frozen in time. If I can finish that thought, I think Hugh was going to say, obviously, that admin data doesn't, delve into complexity in any very profound way, but clearly it can be used, I think. Oh, there you are. Sorry, you froze for a bit there, Hugh. We might need to catch up a sec.
Sorry. Having multiple assistances, and you play with enough data and you see these social patterns everywhere. And if we have had greater insight into some of that more consistently throughout the civil justice system, there's potentially ways of being able to do much more with a little bit more funding and support, as well as making more of the funding and support that's there.
Which leads us to another question that's come through around how services are delivered, and particularly with reference to integrated service provision. So beyond the scope of straight up legal service, whether it's courts and tribunals or legal assistance or dispute resolution organisations, there is another level of service, if you like, which often relates, particularly in complex circumstances, to people's resolution of their legal problems. And that may be through financial counsellors or social workers or educational institutions, all that other stuff. So can you sort of foresee a time when not only are we interested in what's happening inside, the justice system per se, but what's happening at that sort of allied level as well?
Yeah, we're already interested in it, and there's already several initiatives under development for a long period of time. So integrated legal service provision is not new, it's old. We have a better understanding of it now, particularly through some of the research. We know that people have legal and related needs. They have related needs that cause legal needs. It's a bi-directional relationship there. So the particularly public legal services, the nature of the people that are being assisted are the same groups of people that are being assisted by financial counsellors, by mental health support services, by a whole range of community and welfare services. So we think there are better ways of providing those services and getting people what they need when they need it in a form that they need it, by working in smarter ways. And just the recognition that two separate services, they actually share a common client group is an important way forward for thinking about how services might be redesigned and how they might be delivered in a more effective and efficient way.
Richard, does this ring any bells for you? Is there any intent on the part of the Magis Court to engage with other organisations that your clients may, or your court users may be showing up to?
Look, absolutely. I think over the last few years, particularly under the leadership of Her Honour Justice Lisa Hannon, Chief Magistrate of Victoria, we've started to really open our doors to engaging more externally with other service providers. There's clearly a long way to go, and a lot of agency support services out there, and I'm certainly in a role to do that also, and I'm very, very welcome, very happy to come along to sessions like this or other sessions if people are on the call and they want to get in contact. But yeah, it certainly does. And I think reading through some of the chat and referencing it back to the service centre, what we're trying to do is to create capacity locally. So capacity for people to attend court when they're ready, to have access to human beings in the court building and to engage face to face. And the way in which we're doing that is one of the ways in which we're doing that, I should say, is to remove or extract transactional, administrative and non-hearing day inquiries away from that environment into a dedicated team, and thereby flowing that capacity back into that venue. So we are. I appreciate the questions and comments, but we certainly are trying to design our operating model to really be that person-centred. And with 51 locations, 31 regions and hundreds of thousands of matters, that takes a little bit of time. But the court is on a journey, and we're committed to that journey under Her Honour and our CEO, Simon Hollingsworth, to be more user-centred and to construct our operating model in a way that best suits the people of Victoria, and equally offers the most efficient servicing for those people, so that we can get that throughput. So when you turn up to court, you can have some level of certainty that your hearing will be heard on that day, and that you'll be supported appropriately in the way that a court should. And then we can refer people out to the right support services post-court hearing, or indeed pre-court hearing.
Well, on that progressive note, I think we need to draw our conversation to a close, but it's terrific to hear of this sort of development across the Madgies Court. And as you said, 51 courts across the state. That's a huge undertaking to get this show up. And I'm sure, as you've said, there is much to learn yet about how that will work optimally, but it's certainly off to a flying start. So congratulations, Richard, to you and your team. And thanks very much to Hugh for all the work around data mapping. It's been a journey. It was the first thing that I said we would do as a research function at the VLF. So I'm thrilled that we've put a bow on it. And I think what we've delivered, certainly in Calibrating Justice in the Force Report, which if you haven't read, I would recommend to you, is a few thoughts about where to go next. And I think, that opportunity in an environment in Victoria and Australia more broadly, where there is some real appetite and some energy for further developments around this stuff. There's a lot to consider, and we would be delighted to be involved with further conversations about how to push this forward. Hugh, thanks. Good to see you, Richard. Thank you so much to all of you who have joined us. Don't forget, the recording will be available to you very shortly, and please pass it on to friends and family and anyone else who'd like to see it. The slides will be available to you. We'll dispatch those as well. And we look forward very much indeed to seeing you in 2024 for another series of Research Network events. I would love to offer my great thanks and congratulations, particularly to Tennealle Hagland, who is responsible for putting this series together and comes up with fantastic ideas on a very regular basis. And also today to Jackie Matthews, who made it all happen technically. So go well, have a wonderful festive season, and we'll see you next year. Cheers.